funeral director handed me the death certificate, and there it was in black ink. Thomas Michael Patterson, age 34, cause of death, accidental overdose. I signed the papers, arranged the burial, and watched 200 people gather to mourn the loss of a young man they thought they knew. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just burying my son that day. I was burying 34 years of lies I'd told to protect a person who never existed. I'm Frank, and I'm 71 years old. And 3 months ago, I buried my son, Tommy. But the man everyone came to honor at that funeral wasn't my son. He was a fiction I'd spent 3 decades creating, protecting, and maintaining, because I couldn't face the truth about who Tommy really was. Tommy was my youngest child, my only son, the baby of the family who was supposed to carry on the Patterson name. From the day he was born, I had dreams for him. College, career, maybe taking over the small construction business I'd built from nothing. I was going to give him all the opportunities I never had, all the support I'd wished my own father had given me. But Tommy was different from the very beginning. Not different in a way that made him special or gifted. Different in a way that made him manipulative, selfish, and completely incapable of taking responsibility for anything he did wrong. When Tommy was 8, I caught him stealing money from his mother's purse. When I confronted him, he didn't just deny it. He created this elaborate story about how his sister Sarah must have taken it and hidden it in his room to get him in trouble. He was so convincing, so detailed in his lie, that I almost believed him. Almost. When Tommy was 12, he got caught cheating on a test at school, but by the time I got to the parent conference, he'd convinced the teacher that he hadn't been cheating. He'd been helping another student who was struggling. He'd turned himself from the perpetrator into the hero of the story. When Tommy was 16, he wrecked my truck while driving drunk. But when the police arrived, he'd somehow managed to convince his friend Mike to say he'd been driving. Mike took the blame, lost his license, got kicked off the basketball team, and Tommy let it happen without a word of conscience. That's when I should have known. That's when I should have stopped making excuses and started facing the truth about what kind of person my son was becoming. But I didn't. I told myself he was just going through a rough patch, that all teenagers make mistakes, that he'd grow out of it if I just loved him enough and gave him enough chances. So I kept covering for him. I kept believing his stories. I kept protecting him from the consequences of his choices, because I thought that's what good fathers do. I thought love meant never giving up on your child, no matter what they did. Tommy dropped out of college after 2 years, not because he couldn't handle the work, but because he'd been caught selling drugs to other students and was facing expulsion. But the story I told everyone was that college wasn't the right fit for him, that he was too creative for traditional education, that he was taking time to figure out what he really wanted to do with his life. Tommy couldn't keep a job for more than a few months. He'd get hired somewhere, work just long enough to gain people's trust, then start stealing. Money from the register, tools from the job site, equipment from the warehouse. But every time he got fired, he had an explanation that made him the victim. Bad management, workplace politics, people who were jealous of him. And I believed him. Or I pretended to believe him, because the alternative was admitting that my son was a thief and a liar, and I wasn't ready to face that truth. When Tommy was 25, he met Jessica. Beautiful, sweet Jessica, who worked as a nurse and saw something good in Tommy that she thought she could nurture. They got married, and I was so relieved. Finally, I thought, he's found someone who will settle him down, give him a reason to be better. But Tommy didn't get better. He got worse. He convinced Jessica to put the house they bought in her name only because his credit was bad from identity theft that had happened in college. He convinced her to let him handle their finances because he was better with numbers. He convinced her to keep separate bank accounts because it was more romantic for them to surprise each other with gifts. What he was really doing was systematically stealing from her, using her credit cards for cash advances, taking out loans in her name, selling things she owned, and telling her they'd been stolen. By the time she figured it out, he'd destroyed her financially and emotionally. The divorce was ugly. Jessica tried to tell me what Tommy had done to her, but I didn't want to hear it. I told myself she was bitter, that she was exaggerating, that marriages are complicated, and there were probably two sides to the story. I chose to believe my son's version, where Jessica was unstable and vindictive and had turned against him for no reason. But I knew Jessica wasn't lying. Deep down, I knew she was telling the truth about everything. I just couldn't handle facing it, so I chose Tommy's lies over her honesty because his lies were easier to live with. After the divorce, Tommy's life spiraled completely out of control. He moved back in with me and my wife Helen, promising it would just be temporary while he got back on his feet. That was 9 years ago. 9 years of watching him lie, steal, manipulate, and destroy everything he touched while I made excuses and enabled his behavior. He stole from Helen and me constantly. Money from our wallets, jewelry from Helen's dresser, tools from my garage that he'd sell for drug money. When we'd confront him, he'd have explanations. He was borrowing it and forgot to ask. Someone must have broken in. Maybe Helen misplaced her ring and it would turn up eventually. And Helen and I would pretend to believe him because the alternative was admitting that our son was stealing from us in our own home. It was easier to replace the missing money, buy Helen a new wedding ring, pretend we didn't see him going through our things when he thought we were asleep. Our daughter Sarah begged us to kick Tommy out. She could see what he was doing to us, how he was bleeding us dry financially and emotionally. But I couldn't do it. He was my son. You don't give up on your children. You don't abandon them when they're struggling. But Tommy wasn't struggling. Tommy was choosing. Every day he was choosing to lie, steal, and manipulate rather than face reality and take responsibility for his actions. And I was choosing to enable him rather than force him to face consequences. The worst part was watching how Tommy treated Helen in her final years. She had dementia, and Tommy would take advantage of her confusion. He'd convince her to give him money, telling her it was for groceries or bills when it was really for drugs. He'd take her to the bank and have her withdraw cash for emergencies that didn't exist. When Helen died 2 years ago, Tommy delivered a beautiful eulogy about what a wonderful mother she'd been, how much he'd loved taking care of her in her final years. Everyone cried. Everyone talked about what a devoted son he was. And I sat there knowing that he'd spent those final years stealing from a woman with dementia, using her illness as an opportunity to fund his addiction. But I didn't say anything. Even then, even knowing what he'd done to his own dying mother, I kept his secrets. I protected his reputation. I let everyone believe the lie about who Tommy was, because I couldn't bear for them to know the truth. The night Tommy died, I got a call from the police at 2 a.m. They'd found him in a motel room, dead from what appeared to be a heroin overdose. But when I got to the scene, I learned the whole story. Tommy hadn't died alone. He'd been with a 19-year-old girl named Emma, a kid from a good family who'd gotten mixed up with drugs. Tommy had been supplying her, getting her hooked, using her addiction to control her. The night he died, he'd convinced her to try a stronger dose than usual. She'd overdosed first, and instead of calling for help, Tommy had taken her purse, stolen her jewelry, and shot up with the same batch of heroin that had just killed her. By the time he realized he'd taken too much, it was too late. The police found him dead on the floor next to Emma's body, her belongings scattered around him where he'd dropped them after robbing her corpse. That's who my son really was. Not a troubled young man who made mistakes. not a victim of circumstance or addiction or bad luck. He was a predator who spent his final moments on Earth stealing from a teenager he'd helped kill through his greed and selfishness. But at the funeral, I didn't tell anyone that story. I told them Tommy had been struggling with addiction, that he'd been trying to get clean, that his death was a tragic accident. I told them he was a loving son who'd taken care of his mother in her final years. I told them he was missed, mourned, remembered fondly. I told them every lie I'd been telling about Tommy for 34 years, because even in death, I couldn't face the truth about who he really was. Emma's parents were at that funeral. They sat in the back, probably thinking they were honoring the memory of someone who'd been their daughter's friend. They had no idea they were listening to a memorial service for the man who'd gotten their child hooked on drugs and robbed her dead body. That night, after everyone had gone home, after Tommy was in the ground, I sat in my living room and finally admitted the truth to myself. My son hadn't been a good person who made bad choices. He'd been a bad person, period. Manipulative, selfish, cruel, and completely without conscience. And I'd enabled every bit of it. I'd covered for him, lied for him, made excuses for him, and protected him from consequences his entire life. I'd chosen his lies over other people's truth, because his lies allowed me to keep believing I was a good father to a son who deserved my love. But love isn't supposed to be blind to someone's faults. Love isn't supposed to enable destruction and cruelty. Real love should have meant forcing Tommy to face reality, to take responsibility, to become a better person, or face the consequences of staying the same. Instead, I loved him in a way that made it easier for him to be worse. Every time I covered for him, every time I believed his lies, every time I protected him from the natural results of his choices, I made it possible for him to hurt more people. Jessica, the wife he stole from and emotionally destroyed. Helen, the mother he robbed while she was dying. Emma, the teenager he got hooked on drugs and left to die. All of them were Tommy's victims, but they were also mine, because I made Tommy's cruelty possible by refusing to stop it. So when I buried Tommy, I buried all the lies with him. I'm never going to tell Emma's parents what really happened the night their daughter died, because that knowledge would destroy them and wouldn't bring her back. But I'm also never going to tell another lie about who Tommy was. If people ask me about him, I tell them the truth. He was an addict who hurt everyone who tried to help him. He was a thief who stole from his own parents. He was a manipulator who destroyed his marriage and his relationships with everyone who loved him. He died the way he lived, taking advantage of someone more vulnerable than himself. People don't want to hear that truth. They want to remember him as troubled, but lovable, as someone who made mistakes, but had a good heart. They want the comfortable lie instead of the difficult reality. But I'm done providing comfortable lies about uncomfortable truths. I spent 34 years protecting Tommy's reputation at the expense of everyone he hurt, including myself. I chose his version of reality over everyone else's, and the result was that more people got hurt while Tommy never had to change. I'm 71 years old, and my son is dead. And the hardest truth I've had to face is that the world is a safer place without him in it. That's not something any parent should have to think about their child, but it's the reality I created by loving him wrong for his entire life. If you have someone in your life who lies, steals, manipulates, and hurts others while expecting you to cover for them because you love them, stop. Love doesn't mean protecting people from the consequences of their choices. Love means caring enough about them to let them face reality, even if it's painful. I thought I was being a good father by never giving up on Tommy, but what I was really doing was enabling him to be a worse person year after year, until he became someone who could rob a dead teenager without a moment of conscience. Tommy is buried, and his lies are buried with him. But the people he hurt are still living with the damage he caused, and I have to live with the knowledge that I made that damage possible by choosing his lies over their truth. Don't make the mistakes I made. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is stop protecting them from themselves. Sometimes letting someone fail is the only chance they have to eventually succeed. I buried my son and all his lies, but I can't bury the truth anymore. The truth is what should have set him free, if I'd been brave enough to tell it while he was still alive to learn from it. Share this if you think parents should stop enabling their adult children's destructive behavior. And let me know in the comments, have you ever protected someone's lies because facing their truth was too painful? Sometimes love means letting people fall so they can learn to stand on their own.